So there are multiple people at Stripe now today who took us several years to hire.
You are listening to the Serial Entrepreneurs and Business Leaders podcast, where we study billionaires and simplify their nuggets of wisdom.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Serial Entrepreneurs and Business Leaders podcast, where we break down what it is that has made these billionaires so successful.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoy this podcast. It's great. There's a lot of lessons here. We've got a really special life lesson from Patrick Collison at the end. So make sure you stick through and stick with it because it's really, really interesting. And I hope you enjoy this. Principle 1, hire for the future, not just for the now.
There's kind of the great Jeff Bezos quote about how you can just use time horizons as a competitive advantage, in that if you're operating on a 5-year, 7-year time horizon and your competitors are operating quarter to quarter, there's sort of a set of strategies that are open to you that aren't open to them. I think there's a variant of that was kind of, again, not necessarily consciously at the time, but in hindsight kind of open to us, where because we knew there was going to be, say, almost 2 years before we'd launch, we were sort of hiring on a 2-year time horizon, and everyone else was hiring for like almost literally next quarter, right?
Principle 2, test people before you hire them.
I think that it's kind of critically important, or at least extremely valuable, if you can sort of thread the needle, to just work with people before definitively deciding one way or the other. And so there's like all these IP issues and sort of potential pitfalls. I think if you kind of go about things that way, we decided to just kind of run the risk. And so there were a bunch of people that we sort of did a trial week with, or a trial couple weeks, things like this, right? And I ended up deciding not to work with them, and we had to sort of, again, be careful on the paperwork side of things there, but it enabled us to not make bad hires we might otherwise have.
Principle 3, don't just copy successful companies.
Essentially, every company does sort of the same kind of algorithm-style interviews and coding on the whiteboard and so forth. And essentially everyone, at least almost everyone I've talked to, kind of knows that it doesn't really work, right? And yet nothing changes, and it just seems so insane, right? And as far as I can tell, it's sort of you want to be successful. You look at what the successful company does. They do algorithms and interviews on the whiteboard and so forth. And so despite the fact that most technology companies are not about writing algorithms on whiteboards, that you sort of want to translate and to sort of bring across what it is that they do. And it's just like surprisingly robust and resilient. And so we don't do that. We just try to think about, well, what it is that the people at Stripe are actually doing day to day. I mean, they're writing code on their laptops. And so our interviews are largely, we've wrote a core answer about this, but it's largely writing code on your laptop in the environment you're familiar with and experienced with and so forth. And it works really well. And then when people join, they're generally pretty good at writing good code on their laptops. And so anyway, there's this, again, sort of discount factor where I think people just there's too much inertia in the existing ideas. But having said that, in terms of just the organization of a large group of people, default is to trust the mechanism.
Principle 4, hire happy people.
But we tried to hire people who are sort of like particularly nice and just generally happy, in that, if you're sort of to describe the characteristics you wanted your company to have, right? One of the adjectives you'd probably ascribe to the culture, well, at least personally speaking, is happy, right? It seems almost like a tough startup in itself to figure out how to sort of create a culture that like ingests unhappy people and magically makes them happy, right? And, if we succeed at that, we've probably something even more valuable. And so instead of sort of trying to figure out how to solve that at the culture level, we just try to hire people who are intrinsically happy already and kind of cheat in terms of getting to the answer. So we really sought that out.
Principle 5, take great care with your first 10 hires.
In hiring the first 10 people, if you sort of visualize your company at 100 people, like by and large, those residual 90 people are going to a kind of a disconcerting degree. The subsequent 90 are going to be determined by those, say, other 8 people you hire. And so you don't just want them to be good, you want them to be known to be good such that they're going to attract a bunch of other super talented individuals alongside them. And that really played out, and kind of, again, comes to the time horizon thing. There are multiple people at Stripe, like somewhere between maybe 12 and 24, who took us, in each case, years to recruit. There are multiple people at Stripe who took us literally now more than 4 years to recruit.
Principle 6, find the best people and then convince them to work for you.
You can kind of go either sort of, you can filter first by kind of by expressed interest or something, and then you can sort of secondarily filter for, okay, and which ones are good, or you can first look for the good ones and then try to sort of convert them to like expressed interest. And I think that the latter is the more effective way to go about it. But then that means you have to sort of turn this aircraft carrier, where I mean, if you just think kind of ex ante about sort of
the aircraft carrier is the candidate you want to go get.
Exactly right. Yes. Bit of a torture metaphor, but if you just think about sort of the smartest people you know, and you want to get them to work on your thing, I mean, chances are the smartest people you know
are working already.
Yeah,
they like their job.
They have like pretty good paths ahead of them, right? And sort of to kind of
That's
consistently try to rotate these is it just takes a real long time.
Principle 7, allow people to veto your hires.
You actually explicitly allow any employee to veto a new hire?
That is true. Well, inevitably, it's sort of you have to circumscribe it a little bit as you get larger, just because not everyone is involved in every hire. But in the beginning, obviously, way more costly to make a bad hire than to pass on a good one, and so vetoes are really important. We also sort of tried to give people as much opportunity kind of as possible to spot a characteristic that they might want to veto, and so this kind of comes back to you work with them for a week beforehand or something like this. I think that this is the case for literally all of our first maybe 12 or 13 people. We worked with them for at least a week before we made them an offer. And so people they had lunches, dinners, everything with them. And in many cases, we had them stay with us for the first week. That's not always an option, but we really tried to sort of assemble as much data as possible such that folks could spot anything they didn't like.
Principle 8, hire founders first.
And then about 20% of your company founded a company previously?
Yes. Actually, I think it was almost all of the first 10 people had started companies. I think, yes, every one of the first 10. And this kind of comes back to the kind of being known and hitting the ground running. We had sort of a sense for the what we wanted to build on a 1 to 2 year time horizon, and the question was just how can we do that most expediently. And if we were sort of trying to task manage people or sort of just track the whole, I mean, we were not experienced managers ourselves. We sort of wanted to kind of specify the end state and then have sort of self-organizing people who would achieve that as quickly as possible. And again, once I think you're doing something hard and sort of important, it's actually pretty easy to recruit founders, and that by and large their sort of their goal function is something like work on hard problems, be in a role where I can sort of define the future light cone of the company with the best people. But for most founders, at least that I know, the founding bit is not actually critical. It's kind of it's a proxy for those other characteristics.
Principle 9. Onboarding.
Well, you have a very unique onboarding process. Can you talk about that a bit?
What we started out by doing is that every engineer who joined would go and ship something on every other engineering team before they went and joined the team to which they were sort of going to be on long term. And then in general, we sort of tried to encourage, in as much as we could, switching between teams, right? In that even if it wasn't kind of globally optimal for the company because the person had a ton of state, in this area and not in that area, or whatever the case might be, we thought there was kind of long-term culturally good for there to be a lot of sort of cross-pollination in this way. And so now we're sort of at the scale where there's enough engineering teams and they have enough context that that's kind of getting fairly difficult to do. And so I think we'll probably end up with something more like Facebook's bootcamp, where there's this kind of still a designated period where you're not on your sort of, again, long-term assigned teams that you sort of gain broader context across the company, though we haven't implemented that just yet.
Principle 10, have a time delay so that people don't think short term when they hire.
The other thing I'll just kind of briefly flag is that I think it's actually, we didn't really notice this at the time, but it's become clear in hindsight. I think it's really valuable for there to be a time delay between sort of when somebody starts and when they join somebody's team, because it helps correct, I think, one of those pernicious forces in hiring where there's kind of a principal agent problem between the team and the company. The team wants the team is overburdened, they've too much shit to get done, they sort of really need more people, right? And so kind of their incentive is to hire more people, even if potentially they're sort of below the kind of the global average of the company. And then, of course, from the company standpoint, you don't care any more than sort of on a relative basis about the what's going on sort of a particular team. And so I think having the time delay there means that it's much harder to kind of quickly hire people to solve a short-term problem, right? You're not going to be able to sort of quell the hair on fire issue today by hiring more people. And so by imposing, we accidentally, I guess, imposed a 1 to 2 month delay. I think now actually that perhaps should be even longer, that it's like 3 months between sort of the requisition request and when you actually get someone.
Principle 11, meet your potential customers in person.
People would always talk about the Collison brothers running around, going to people's offices and like installing their API into the web apps and, in true do things don't scale fashion. And I assume you were not only trying to make sure they installed it, but also get user feedback.
Well, it sort of served two purposes. One is to your point. It served as a really good way to kind of get to do user research and to get kind of UX feedback and so on. And if you've done this, I'm sure you've had the experience where you design what you're absolutely certain is the most streamlined, user-friendly, straightforward, frictionless way to do whatever it is the product does. And then you kind of you present it and kind of put it in front of a user, and you just kind of ask them to do whatever it is, and they find it completely impenetrable, and like they're clicking all the wrong links, and they can't find the next button, even though the next button is there blinking in green and stuff. And so it's invariably sort of incredibly painful. There's sort of nothing so sobering as watching somebody use kind of the first version of some new product. But the other reason for us was, we would suggest to somebody they use Stripe or they switch to Stripe or whatever, and invariably the response is, "Oh yeah, sure, that sounds awesome." But it can be that they'll postpone it and they'll postpone it again, and just like there's never a moment where it's like, okay, this is the evening where I'm going to switch to Stripe. And so us going and sort of accosting them in person sort of helped. People talk about in sales, it's always like a why you and a why this and a why now and these kinds of questions. And going in person kind of created a why now moment. It's like, well, we're here at your house.
Did you just show up?
No, we tried to be kind of at least semi-invited.
Principle 12, read.
Why do you you spend more time reading history of everything really than almost anybody I follow on Twitter? Why do you do that?
It's a way to cheat in that everyone else ignores all the good ideas from history, and so you can just be much smarter by just. You could just try to think all these incredibly original thoughts by sort of sitting down and sort of staring at the wall for days on end, or you can sort of cheat by just they are in fact written down in books that you can just read. And again, I kind of mean that a little bit facetiously, but I think that sort of Alan Kay has this quote about computer science where he calls it sort of pop culture. But by sort of which he means that sort of for most kind of communities or sort of again subcultures or whatever the case might be, there's a progression, right? Things build upon what came before. Whereas in computer science and in so much of technology, it's sort of just this like Brownian motion through the problem space, and sort of with no account given to kind of what's come previously. And I think that sort of we as an industry do ourselves an enormous disservice by sort of being so blind and kind of blithely ignorant to it.
Principle 13, understand your customer's experience.
We really tried very hard to understand in sort of very granular detail what exactly it was that people were doing, where they were tripping up and so on. So just to give you some examples, we had a chat room for sort of providing support when people were integrating Stripe, and it was actually a public chat room, which kind of had some downsides because if we'd broken something or if somebody had some kind of embarrassing issue, sort of everyone would see it. But we thought that was kind of good because it would actually kind of put more pressure on us to sort of have the product be good. We had literally every time, sort of for the first, call it 10 users of Stripe, every time somebody sent an API request to Stripe, like it sent an email to us. So we were like looking at every single API request. And if we saw users do something weird, we're like, well, why did they do that? Right? In the email, we literally had a list of businesses that had submitted 3 or 5 or something API requests, but it's sort of not gone live. They'd not launched their businesses. We literally just had the emails of all these businesses. The idea was that we would literally individually reach out to them. It's like, hey, you kind of seem to use Stripe a little bit, but you didn't you didn't go live. Like, did we screw up, or was the product somehow inadequate or whatever? We did things like every time anyone ever hit an error of any sort, that generated like a high priority email to us, and so we would sort of try to immediately go solve it, and that also kind of generated sort of, I think, this pleasant kind of user experience where, it's frustrating when you hit an error in some service, but we could then often sort of 15 minutes later reach out to them and say, hey, we saw that you have encountered this problem. It's all fixed now. And sometimes we did that even in the case where sort of the user just made a silly mistake and that they kind of mistyped an API parameter or something, and we just reach out to them and be like, "Hey, noticed you had a typo in your code," which perhaps to some of them was a little bit unsettling, but at least kind of helped us increase the kind of the throughput of product feedback. But so these are all kind of examples, I would say, of the sort of general pattern of sort of really trying to be kind of hyper attentive to all the micro details of sort of what people were doing with the product and kind of iterating rapidly in response to it.
Principle 14, consider radical transparency.
Essentially, all internal communication is public throughout the company, so that if you're interested in what the legal team is working on or the partnerships team or who knows, you can go and you can sort of get that context. And the thinking behind it is that we want people to sort of make the best local decisions, and ideally without us having to sort of manage the overhead of sort of trying to get them to understand the overall framework. Things would be much more efficient if they can just sort of pull as needed, and sort of when they're making a decision on, I don't know, which bank they're going to integrate, they can go and look at the sales pipelines in different countries or whatever the case might be. And I think it's actually been quite effective there. And so this is, I guess, transparency motivated by desire for kind of federated understanding, right?
Principle 15, it's not bad to start a business with family.
I do think that the common case for like the really high growth startup is for the co-founder kind of set to break apart. Like, it generally doesn't persist. And so you look at most companies, right? Sort of there's some schism or disagreement or whatever that kind of proves insurmountable. And I think that sort of having a really strong kind of foundational relationship there, sort of, a filial relationship is, I guess, one version of that. But even if it's not that, sort of, I think the cases where sort of you know the person for like upwards of a decade, that those in general seem to fare kind of much better. Yeah. And so in that sense, I think it's been basically really helpful where we have the kind of relationship where there's kind of there's no difficulty in telling the other person that you're really screwing this up, right? Yeah. Or this is like completely broken, or kind of whatever the case might be, because it's a given that sort of those situations are going to arise. And so the question is only kind of how effectively can you react to them? Principle
16, give equity to early employees, not a high salary.
This is actually in part advice that I got from Sam Altman. I think for him it was maybe just an offhand comment, though for some reason it stuck with me. He said that be extremely generous with your employees and be less generous with your investors. And I think he used a more aggressive term than less generous, but we are at the Coastal Summit. You're definitely not going to regret sort of a marginal couple of additional percentage points that you've given those early employees and the people who kind of built the company with you. And so I think it's not really so much a kind of necessarily sort of a financially motivated decision, so much as something kind of more personal, right? And that you really want those people to do exceptionally well. I think there are kind of some benefits to it where they themselves will sort of identify more as being founders of the company, as it's not quite sort of a binary state; it's more sort of a continuum. And so we, for our first 10 people at Stripe, we gave away more than 10% of the equity, which there's kind of sparse data on this, but I think is atypically high. And all through the company, we've generally tried to be, and actually now we're sort of putting proper comp frameworks in place and things like that. We've tried to generally be not exactly sort of stingy, but noticeably sort of less aggressive than other companies on salary. We sort of aim for no more than 50% of kind of median for the role. We're just not going to compete there. We don't want the people who, for whom this would be kind of the deciding factor. The data here is sparse, but it's our sense that our retention of those people who've now been with us for like 4+ years is much higher than normal.
Principle 17, build a decision-making framework.
And it's not always the case that despite being the CEO, I'm the person who, like, in the case of disagreement, it's not all the case that I prevail. Sort of our kind of dispute resolution framework is kind of much more around which of us cares more than kind of which of us holds this title or that. And I think because we're brothers, we've been able to kind of get to this unusual situation where we really do run it together. Because I think it is important to just have an efficient mechanism for reaching a decision, and it can't be sort of simply oriented around consensus, right? If there are sort of three co-founders and sort of none of you sort of quite want to, or nobody is a clear CEO, and you don't have some kind of efficient mechanism for sort of having decisions get made, I think that is a recipe for failure.
Principle 18, don't reinvent every wheel.
So the harder bit, I suppose, is that we're relatively conventionally organized, and that sort of I think there's always such a temptation sort of when you're starting out to go and sort of reconceive the nature of humanity and how people can collaborate and coordinate and so forth. And that basically you should really kind of try to discourage that inner voice. And I think it sort of comes from a good place where you want to kind of reconceive all of these things, right? But there's two problems with that. The first is that you kind of need to think about sort of what risks you're taking in the business, and sort of empirically the standard means of organization are sufficiently effective to create the Googles and the Facebooks and the Intels and so forth of the world. And so, I mean, even if just posit that sort of you're actually capable of conceiving a more effective way of having tens, hundreds, thousands of people working together, whether you actually need that to achieve your actual goals. And the second one is that probably all of the problems with any alternative that you could conceive are things that you haven't been exposed to sort of to date, and you just don't have the life experience to sort of anticipate. And so basically whatever you think you should probably do instead, you're almost certainly wrong.
Principle 19, have engineers end to end.
I think there's also a way in which, in general, one of the things we've sort of really pushed in the engineering culture is sort of the traditional view of engineers in the Valley is very much sort of engineers as implementers, right? You have the product requirements document, you have the product manager, you have the market research, you have all the things, right? And then the engineer sort of types out the Javas. And we basically said that the engineer should be doing everything end to end. They should be talking to the customers, they should be designing the product, they should be building V1 of it, they should be showing that to the customers, going to the office, getting the feedback, and sort of the complete feedback loop right through to writing the blog post at the end. And so this was kind of motivated by, there's a tendency for companies, I think, to take this kind of simplifying abstraction of people are a particular thing in a particular function, and sort of that's a simpler kind of atom with which you can assemble the corporate molecule. But of course, people are people and not just kind of their specific functions. So we sort of try to allow for that a little bit more.
Life lesson 20, you may not feel happy as you build your business, but you may find yourself feeling fulfilled.
Well, happy is such a squishy concept, right? But when I look back sort of through life at the things that I'm sort of most glad I did, I wasn't exactly happy while doing them. Like often I was very stressed out, or I had to work really hard or whatever, but sort of they're the things that kind of post hoc brought the most fulfillment. I think that, whatever, there's a rich literature here, and so I won't kind of dive too deeply into it, but I do think kind of happiness is a tricky concept to kind of pin down, because is it kind of happiness in the moment? Is it sort of the sense that you have a year later looking back and so on? And so I think, language is squishy and it's not, completely specifically defined, but I think kind of generally speaking, kind of a better utility function and kind of gradient to try to climb is that of fulfillment. And so I would say kind of the experience of doing Stripe was, it was not especially happy because we were sort of, constantly sort of, incredibly aware of all the ways in which the product was severely deficient and, all the challenges we faced. And it seemed like there was no fintech category back then. It was just like two teenagers or, just over teenagers trying to compete with PayPal, which, many people told us was not an especially kind of promising avenue to pursue. So not especially happy per se, but it did feel kind of fulfilling. And it felt that like if it worked, it could be kind of consequential in the world. And so I would say, I don't know what it feels like to be sort of a scientist or something, but I'm guessing when you're sort of pursuing you have this kind of big question and you're pursuing all these kind of avenues to sort of try to better understand it. And I'm guessing day to day, it's sort of not especially happy because most of your experiments don't work or whatever. But sort of perhaps there's some analog there in terms of it still feels in some sense meaningful.
Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe if you get the chance and give us a 5-star rating on Apple if you could be so kind. We hope you really enjoyed this and got some useful lessons out of it. See you soon.